It was a cold, stormy night in the small town of Ravenwood. Amelia had just moved into an old Victorian house at the edge of town. She loved the creaky charm of the place with its tall windows and winding staircases. Despite the warnings from the locals about the house's dark history, she was determined to make it her own. One evening, as the rain pelted against the windows and the wind howled through the trees, Amelia settled into her new living room with a cup of tea and a book. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floors. She had just begun to relax when the landline phone on the table beside her rang, piercing the silence. She hesitated. She hadn't given the number to anyone yet. Who could be calling? Tentatively, she picked up the receiver. "Hello?" she said, her voice trembling slightly. There was no response, only the faint sound of static on the other end. "Hello?" she repeated, a bit louder this time. Still nothing. She hung up, dismissing it as a prank call, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Minutes later the phone rang again. This time she snatched it up immediately. "Who is this?" she demanded. A chilling whisper came through the static, barely audible. "I see you." Amelia's heart raced. She looked around the room, trying to shake off the creeping dread. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice now shaking. There was a long pause. Then the whisper came again, clearer this time. "I'm closer than you think." She slammed the phone down, breathing heavily. It had to be a sick joke, she thought, but the fear gnawed at her. She checked all the locks and windows, making sure everything was secure. Hours passed, and the storm raged on. Just as Amelia was starting to doze off, the phone rang again. She let it ring, too scared to answer. The ringing stopped, and she let out a sigh of relief. But then she heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from upstairs. She froze, straining to hear over the pounding rain. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the attic. Gathering her courage, she grabbed a flashlight and slowly made her way up the creaky staircase. At the attic door, she paused, her hand hovering over the knob. Taking a deep breath, she turned it and pushed the door open. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating dusty old furniture and cobwebs. Then she saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the corner. Her blood ran cold. The figure slowly turned towards her, its eyes glowing in the dark. She stumbled back, her flashlight falling from her hand and clattering to the floor. The figure stepped forward, revealing a ghastly face with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. "I told you," it whispered, its voice echoing in the confined space. "I'm closer than you think." Amelia screamed and ran, her footsteps echoing in the empty house. She didn't stop until she was out in the rain, her heart pounding in her chest. She never went back to that house, and the townspeople said it stood empty, the whispers of the silent caller echoing through its halls, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to answer. Sam and Lisa had been looking forward to their camping trip for months. They chose a remote spot in the dense, sprawling woods of Pine Hollow, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a chance to reconnect with nature and each other. The first day was perfect. They hiked, set up their tent, and enjoyed a campfire under the stars. As night fell, the forest around them came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. It was serene and calming, and they soon fell asleep to the gentle chorus of crickets and the rustling of leaves. But in the middle of the night, Sam was jolted awake by a strange noise. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from the direction of the trees. He sat up, straining to see through the darkness, but there was nothing there. He shook it off, thinking it was just a branch swaying in the wind, and went back to sleep. The next day passed without incident, but that night the tapping returned. This time it was louder and closer. Sam lay still, listening intently. It sounded almost like footsteps. He nudged Lisa awake. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Lisa listened, her eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" "I don't know. Stay here," Sam said, grabbing a flashlight. He unzipped the tent quietly and stepped out into the cold night. The forest was pitch black, his flashlight beam barely piercing the darkness. He swept the light around, but saw nothing unusual. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. There was no response, just the echo of his words among the trees. After a few tense minutes, he returned to the tent, assuring Lisa that it was probably just an animal. The next morning, they found strange footprints around their campsite. They were human-like, but distorted and large. Sam and Lisa exchanged worried glances but decided to stay, determined not to let their trip be ruined by some forest prankster. That night, the tapping returned, more insistent and closer than ever. Sam couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He stayed up, clutching a knife and flashlight, but nothing happened. By the fourth night, the atmosphere had turned oppressive. The tapping now seemed to be coming from all directions. Sam was on edge, his nerves frayed. Lisa was too scared to sleep, and they both sat huddled in the tent, waiting for dawn. Around midnight, the tapping stopped. There was a moment of eerie silence. Then a low, guttural whisper echoed through the forest, chilling them to the bone. "Leave, now." Panicked, Sam grabbed Lisa's hand. "We need to go," he said urgently. They hurriedly packed their things, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every passing second. As they were about to leave, they saw something in the distance, a tall, shadowy figure standing among the trees, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They ran, not stopping until they reached their car. As they sped away, they could still hear the whisper echoing in their minds. "Leave, now." Back in the safety of their home, they tried to make sense of what had happened. They researched Pine Hollow and discovered that many years ago, a group of settlers had mysteriously vanished in those woods. Local legends spoke of a watcher, a guardian spirit that protected the land by driving away intruders. Sam and Lisa never returned to Pine Hollow, but they couldn't shake the feeling that the watcher was still out there, guarding its territory, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitors to wander too deep into its woods. Emily loved collecting dolls. Her collection was vast, filled with dolls of all shapes and sizes, each with its own unique history. One day, while browsing an antique shop in a small, forgotten town, she stumbled upon a doll that immediately caught her eye. It was old, with porcelain skin, glassy blue eyes, and curly blonde hair, wearing a faded blue dress with intricate lace. The shopkeeper seemed reluctant to sell it. "Are you sure you want this one?" he asked. "There are many other beautiful dolls here." But Emily was insistent. She felt a strange connection to the doll, as if it were calling out to her. She purchased it and brought it home, placing it in a glass cabinet with the rest of her collection. That night, as Emily was getting ready for bed, she thought she heard a faint, whispering sound. She paused, listening intently, but heard nothing more, and dismissed it as her imagination. The next morning, she found the doll sitting on her dresser, its glassy eyes staring straight at her. Confused, she put the doll back in the cabinet, making sure to lock the door. But the same thing happened the following night, and the night after that. Every morning, the doll was somewhere different, always watching her. Disturbed, Emily decided to investigate. She returned to the antique shop and asked the shopkeeper about the doll's history. He sighed and reluctantly shared its story. Many years ago, a little girl named Annabelle owned that doll. She loved it dearly, but one night, she and the doll vanished without a trace. Her parents were devastated and eventually moved away. The doll reappeared in the attic of their old house, and every family that lived there afterward reported strange occurrences. Some said they heard whispers. Others claimed the doll moved on its own. It's been passed around ever since, always bringing misfortune to its owners. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She had to get rid of the doll. That night, she placed it in a box and drove to a nearby lake, intending to throw it in. As she reached the water's edge, the air grew cold, and the wind howled around her. She hesitated, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly, she heard a child's voice, soft and sad. "Please don't," it said. Terrified, Emily dropped the box and fled to her car. When she returned home, she found the doll sitting on her bed, its blue eyes gleaming in the dark. She knew she had to do something drastic. She decided to burn it. She built a small fire in her backyard and threw the doll in. The flames roared to life, and for a moment Emily felt a sense of relief. But then the fire flared up unnaturally high, and she heard a high-pitched scream. The flames died down, leaving behind only ashes. Emily thought it was over, but that night she woke to the sound of a child crying. She looked around her dark bedroom and saw standing in the corner a shadowy figure of a little girl. The girl stepped forward, her face pale and eyes hollow. "Why did you burn my doll?" she asked, her voice filled with sorrow. Emily couldn't move, paralyzed with fear. The girl approached, her form flickering like a candle flame. "I just wanted to be your friend," she whispered, reaching out with icy fingers. The next morning, Emily was found in her bed, her face frozen in a look of terror. In her arms was the doll, pristine and whole, its blue eyes glinting in the morning light. The doll was passed on, and the legend continued, each new owner falling victim to its eerie curse.